Okay, now that we've gotten all the preliminaries taken care of, let me once again formally welcome everyone in attendance to the presentation that we have today given by Guild member Steve Johnson. Steve has a degree in U.S. history from San Francisco State and has been an educator for 30 years. He's taught California history and has played an actor in many California character roles. To name a few, James Marshall, Emperor Norton, and Domingo Ghirardelli. He is a National Park Service volunteer on Alcatraz, the Presidio, and Fort Point, and runs walk-along tours in San Francisco. He's also a board member of the Pacifica Historical Society. Steve has a broad portfolio of tours and presentations and is willing to share many of them with us. I'm sure you will show your appreciation by sending a PayPal gratuity, both in appreciation for today's tour and as inspiration for many more to come. Steve will share with you his intention as how he will utilize any gratuities received. Steve's PayPal link is paypal.me/Stephen, STEPHEN, J587. We hope you'll enjoy the presentation, and with that, I'll pass it on to Steve. Thank you very much, Steve, and welcome to our Zoom meeting.
Hello, everyone, and I want to thank Len, Roberto, and Helen especially for allowing this presentation to happen for the Guild. I offered to do this presentation because I support the mission of the Guild to educate its members on current events as well as the history of California. And now, during this unprecedented reevaluation of the role of missions in California history, I want to show the beginning of the Spanish colonization of native California and its implications to the future. And by the way, I know the Guild suggests to its members that they can offer a gratuity for any of the presentations by members of the Guild. And I would just like to say that if you so choose to offer a gratuity after this presentation, all gratuities I receive are going to go to the Navajo people who are suffering greatly through this pandemic. Their death rate is almost as high per capita as that of New York, but they don't have the resources of that state at all. So I will take any money that you offer and match it with my donation to send to the Navajo Health Service. And I want to thank you for considering that. Prior to 1769, the native people of California had lived for thousands of years in perfect harmony with nature and with each other. They had adapted to their specific environment, from the Modoc tribe of the northern mountains to the Yuma tribe of the southern deserts. (1769) was really the milestone in the history of the state because they laid the foundation for naming many of the locations throughout the state and setting the locations for cities and churches and the mission system. So we'll talk about its impact on the state and on its people. So prior to the Spanish coming into Alta California, California had the largest population of indigenous people in all of the United States, probably because it was so bountiful, they could find food everywhere, and the climate was mild, and they believed the population before contact was anywhere from 300,000 to 800,000. It's hard to know exactly because there were no censuses back then, but so they had to do a lot of estimating. But the interesting thing is that there are at least 200 tribes in California, and they all had different languages because that shows us that there were waves of immigration coming into California, and they brought languages from other places. So you could be living, say, in the Bay Area and travel across the Bay to, say, what is now Marin County, and you'd experience a whole different language, just like 20 miles or 30 miles away. So that's one of the things that the Spanish noticed right away, is that all these different tribes had different languages. The motivation to explore Alta California came from the Viceroy in Mexico. They were worried about the Russians in Alaska coming down and coming into California, which was claimed by Spain. So they decided to send an expedition to settle the port of Monterey. They knew about San Diego Bay and Monterey Bay and San Francisco Bay, and I'm talking about the outside San Francisco Bay, because of Spanish explorers in previous centuries that had sort of mapped the coastline. So they knew about Monterey Bay. They had sort of a rough sketch of it, and they sent this man to be the leader of the expedition. This is Gaspar de Portola. He was a captain in the Spanish army. He was born in Bolujar, Spain in 1716, and served as a soldier in both Portugal and Italy. So by the time he came to New Spain in Mexico, he already had lots of military experience. And his first job, which was sort of tricky, was to kick out all the Jesuits from the missions in Baja California, because the Pope was thinking the Jesuits were getting too big for their britches. So he wanted to kick out the Jesuits and put in the Franciscans. So that was his first job. And then he was told that he was going to lead the expedition going into Alta California. So the expedition really consisted of two parts. One was the supply ships coming up from Baja California, coming into San Diego Bay, and the other expedition was a land expedition led by Portola, which set out from Loreto.
The two expeditions were to meet at the Bay of San Diego. The ships were the first to arrive, but the crews were in terrible shape due to scurvy. Out of a total number of 90, only 16 sailors and soldiers were alive. When the land expedition finally arrived, the first thing they had to do was to minister to the sick crews on the beach. This is an artist's rendition of the Spanish raising the cross with members of the Kumeyaay tribe looking on. This took place around the mouth of the San Diego River in June of 1769.
One of the priests that had come up was Father Juan Crespi, and he did an invaluable service by keeping a record of the journey. And he was a wonderful diarist. He had a keen eye. He was very observant, very perceptive. And not only did he describe the people they encountered in great detail, but he also described the plants and the animals on the terrain that they saw. So it's a great look into what California was like prior to colonization. This wonderful painting by Catherine Baxter, rather fanciful, but I like it because it's so colorful. It kind of gives you a sense of where things are. If you want to know where the Spanish actually landed, if you look at this map and you look towards the left center, or just below left center, you'll see the San Diego airport. And if you go to the left of the airport, you will see Harbor Island. And you'll see some little sailboats in Harbor Island. Well, just on the other side of those little sailboats was Spanish Landing. It's a park. It's not very big, but it does show that's where the Spanish landed. And there was a Kumeyaay village in present-day Old Town. So that's where Serra built his first little mission out of logs. And then sometime later, he moved the mission over into the hills. You'll see it over to the far right. You'll see Mission San Diego. And he wanted to keep it away from where the soldiers were, but it also was a better location because it was closer to the river and closer to the Indian villages there. The original adobe building of Mission San Diego de Alcala was finished in 1813, but like all missions, it fell into disrepair after the Mexican government secularized them in the 1840s. This present-day mission was actually completed in 1931 and is still a parish church. So this was the first of 21 missions, which stretched all the way from San Diego in the south to Sonoma in the north. When California became a state, many missions were overrun or abandoned or sold. President Lincoln returned most of the missions to the Catholic Church in about 1863. So all these missions have been returned and are parish churches except for two. And I'm wondering if you know the two that are state parks. If you guess Sonoma State Park, Sonoma Mission, yep, that's a state park. And the other is the La Purísima Mission, which is also a state park. So Portola set out with 64 people. There were 4 officers, 27 soldados de carrera, seen here, 7 Catalan volunteer soldiers, Sergeant Ortega as the lead scout, Miguel Costanzo, who was the engineer, who also was a journalist, by the way, and we have his diary as well. 2 priests, including Father Crespi, 7 muleteers, and 16 Christian Indians. Some of the names of these soldiers you'll be very familiar with, and if you spend any time in the Sunset District, you'll remember the names of the streets there are named after these early explorers, Spanish explorers. So you have Moraga, Noriega, Ortega, Pacheco, Quintara, Rivera, Santiago, Terranel, Ulloa, Vicente. Now, Wawona is a
I'm
stretch.
having trouble seeing
No.
the pictures.
Please don't say that.
Anybody else having trouble seeing the pictures?
I see the picture.
Okay. So continuing with those streets in the Sunset District, you've got Taravel, Ulloa, Vicente. Then you have Wawona, Xerxes, Yorba, and Zorba. And you really have to look for that Zorba street. It's sort of hidden away, but that's the alphabet in the Sunset District. Now, there are a lot of familiar names for these soldiers too, because they became the beginnings of prominent Spanish families in the Bay Area. You've got the Soberantes, the Alvarados, the Amadors, the Cabrillos, the Peñas. And many of their families are still around in the Bay Area. So they used 50 burros to carry the packs. There were 50 of them, and they chose the burros because they were strong and docile. They could carry about 200 pounds each. And the expedition had over 100 packs of provisions for a 6-month journey. They did have some donkeys too. The donkeys also carried tools and tents and beads to trade with the native people. They didn't like using donkeys so much because donkeys can be very ornery, kind of like passengers after a long bus trip. So as they were proceeding northward, they came to these fields outside of what is now Oceanside, and the Spanish were absolutely astounded by what they saw, these beautiful fields of thousands and thousands of wildflowers. Crespi said it almost looked like it had been planted there. The area was so rich in plants and greenery. Of course, they were coming in November, so they had the rain, so it was very beautiful. In fact, Crespi said this would be a beautiful place for a mission. And 29 years later, Mission San Luis Rey was built near that valley. Initially, by the way, the Louisiana people who lived there told the Spanish to go away, but I guess the Padres who came much later were very convincing. And so they started baptizing the native people there. And at one point, the lands of this mission extend 900,000 square acres. They had huge fields of crops and cattle. And its high point, 5,000 Luiseno people lived at the mission. It was called the King of the Missions. Now, the Luiseno people still come to the mission to have their powwows every year, and they welcome other tribes to join them in what's called fancy dancing. In fact, this woman, number 156, you can see it says San Luis Rey Band of Mission Indians. So these, some of these tribes still have ties to the mission because that's where their ancestors lived and that's where they are buried. So that is the connection to the mission. Here's a rough map of the San Diego and Orange County counties, and you'll see where San Luis Rey is, near Oceanside. And if you continue north, you'll see Las Pulgas Canyon. As you probably know, Las Pulgas is the fleas. And they tried camping there, but the fleas were so bad, they decided to keep moving. And they eventually went northeast to Trabuco Canyon. And I need to explain that. So here's one of those places where the expedition actually walked through. You can still walk on the same pathway that the expedition went. These are in the foothills of the Santa Ana Mountains in eastern Orange County. And it was here that one of the soldiers lost his trabuco. And I have to explain what that is. So these Soldados de Cuera were sort of the lead soldiers. They carried lances. They were called leather-jacketed soldiers because their jacket was made of deer skin, many layers of deer skin, which protected them from arrows. And they also carried a shield, which was made of bull hide. So that too was a way of shielding off arrows. And the lance, of course, could keep people away that you want to keep away. And if you look over on his saddle, you can see a trabuco. So this was a firearm that was muzzle loading. You had to load it from the barrel. And they usually had a wide opening so that you could fill it with powder while you're riding your horse. So you take your powder pouch and you pour it in while you're riding. And then you had a rope that was lit, and you'd use that to actually fire the thing. Well, anyway, the soldier somehow lost his trabuco. And so Father Crespi decided to name the valley the Trabuco Canyon. And I'm sure that the soldier was mortified that forever after that in history, he'd be known for losing his firearm there in the canyon. So they were continuing north. Those are the Santa Ana Mountains to the north. And it was here that they were met by 200 villagers of the Akim-Emin people. This is a whole different tribe. And they were, this is how Crespi described it. They mingled with us with as much familiarity as they could have done with their own countrymen. Time and time again, these native people would come and welcome the Spanish with gifts, food, sometimes shell beads, sometimes other things. But by and large, the native people were very agreeable and kind to the Spanish. It was here that Crespi was hoping these friendly people would want to kiss the religious relics he was showing them, but they declined. But nevertheless, he decided this to be a good place for a mission. And in 1776, Mission San Juan Capistrano was founded, the same year as Mission San Francisco de Asís. The chapel is said to be the oldest standing stone structure in California. The mission was being restored in the 1920s by Father John O'Sullivan. One day he noticed a local innkeeper was knocking down the nests of the mud swallows in the eaves of his building, and the birds were rightly upset. "If you knock down those nests, where are the birds going to go?" asked the priest. "I don't care," said the innkeeper. "I just don't want them here." So Father O'Sullivan said to the birds, "Come along, swallows. There's plenty of room for you at the church." And the swallows have come back ever since. This legend added to the romantic view of the missions. The view is also inspired by the popular book Ramona and by the song When the Swallows Returned to San Juan Capistrano. Up until recently, the true history of the missions was never told honestly in textbooks or at the missions, but things are slowly changing. Because by the turn of the century, by the 1900s, most of the missions were in terrible state. They started restoring them, especially through the Depression. The WPA was given the job of restoring most of the missions to their original look. The expedition traveled over the Santa Ana Mountains and came into this valley, and they came to the Santa Ana River, which Crespi described as a good-sized river going through the midst of a plain. And it was here they experienced the first of a number of earthquakes. And so Crespi named the place Dulcísimo Nombre de Jesús del Río de los Temblores, which is most sweet name of Jesus, the river of the earthquakes. Maybe that's where the expression sweet Jesus came from, when people feel an earthquake. But anyway, this is the longest coastal river in Southern California, going from the San Bernardino Mountains all the way down to Huntington Beach. And at that time, it was described as clear and free flowing and not too deep, so they didn't have any trouble crossing it. 80 years later, that's not that long, 80 years later, German immigrants would settle near this river and call it Anaheim, or House of the Anna. And the expedition camped along the river just 2 miles from present-day Disneyland. So here was the San Gabriel Valley. To the right would have been the river. In the forefront, you could probably make it out. There's Disneyland with the monorail going around. You can see Snow White's castle, the Matterhorn, and then in the distance are the San Gabriel Mountains. Of course, this shot was taken in the wintertime when there was actually snow on the mountains. And that's the source of water for much of the immediate area, because there are dams in the area to hold back the water. They proceeded west through the San Gabriel Valley, which at that time was full of oak trees, grasslands, creeks, and willow trees, and many villages of the Tongva people. Here you see orange groves, palm trees full of dates, and acres of farms. Orange County used to be one of the most productive agricultural areas in the country. The first orange trees were planted in the 1870s, and by the 1940s, there were 67,000 acres of orange groves. Now, to see an orange grove, you have to go to Citrus Ranch Park in Tustin. Those mountains in the distance are the San Bernardino Mountains, and that is Mount San Bernardino in the distance. So they met the Tongva people who live throughout the Los Angeles basin. And these are Tongva men wearing the traditional headdresses made of feathers and porcupine quills and shell beads. I once asked them the significance of all those, and they said they couldn't tell me because they were sacred. So I respected that, but to them, these were very important headdresses worn during ceremonial occasions. They probably wore them when they met the Spanish because they wanted to make a good impression on them. But you can see a lot of Native people, including the Pomos and the Miwok, had similar types of headdresses So this probably, I'm guessing, the man on the left was could very well be the chief of the tribe at that time. Well, this was later in time, but could have been the chief. One of the things the Spanish were given were chia seeds. So there's the chia plant, and these are the seeds. This was a staple crop for many, many California tribes because chia is nutritious. It has protein, but lots of fat. 3 times more the amount of fat than acorns. And of course, fat is important in your diet, especially to keep you warm during the wintertime. So you could store chia seeds. And the people would crush the seeds and add water to them, maybe a little bit of honey. And I've had chia pudding. It's really quite tasty. The main crop for most tribes was the acorn. There are 3 species of oak trees in California. The most prized was the black oak because they produce the sweetest acorns. And in order to process them, you have to get the nut out and grind them down and then rinse them out many, many times to get out the tannin. Otherwise, it's poisonous. The Spanish learned that to their dismay. They didn't know this process. So at one point they were hungry and tried eating acorns and they all got sick. So they didn't know that you have to leach out the tannins. And then you can make acorn porridge, acorn soup, or you can let the powder dry and make acorn bread. The great thing about acorns is you can store them during the wintertime so you have a source of protein during the winter. These baskets are some of the greatest in the world, made by California tribes. They're highly prized and they are astoundingly beautiful, not only because of their techniques, but these are so tightly woven they can hold water. Here is a woman who's cooking in an Indian basket. You're probably wondering, how did they do that? Well, they'd fill a basket with water and then they'd put in a hot rock and you'd use some tongs to keep the hot rock moving around so it doesn't burn the basket. But within minutes, that hot rock will bring the water to a boil. Then you can pour in the things for your stew or your soup or porridge. And that was very sustaining. They would cook, for whole families that way. So if you want to see some fabulous California Indian baskets, you can go to the Museum of the Native American in Novato or the Anthropology Museum at UC Berkeley, where you can see some of these fabulous baskets. They're currently still being made by Pomo and Miwok women who give classes from time to time up there. And anybody can take the class because they don't want the craft to die out. Only a few women still know this skill. The Tongva people helped to create this little display to make it accurate. So here's a typical California Indian home. And you could see that it was actually very efficient. So the framework is made out of willow branches, which are easy to bend. So you make the framework of willow. And then starting at the bottom, you put layers and layers of tule, layer over from the bottom to the top with a little hole at the top to let the smoke out. And these homes are surprisingly waterproof and very cozy. You have a deerskin flap for the door, and it can protect you quite well from the elements. Next to it is a shade structure because most of their activities were outdoors. So to keep you from burning in the sun, you would have this shade structure where you can do your work like making arrowheads and grinding acorns and things like that. The Tongva people are very active and they too come to the mission, the San Gabriel mission for various activities during the year. By the way, they would burn those buildings periodically just to get all the pests out, and then they could put up one of those buildings in one day. That's how easy it was. Of course, it would take several days to cut all the tule needed, but they were surprisingly easy to build. The San Gabriel Valley was very bountiful, and the San Gabriel Mission was known for its grain production and its wine production. They sent wine all over to the other missions, if they didn't have vineyards. They also were probably the most, next to San Luis Rey, they were probably the most bountiful of all the missions, because they, again, set up with the labor of the native people, they set up aqueducts to give water to all the crops there. And this particular building was built in 1806. Father Crespi thought the area was perfect for a pueblo, and later in 1781, immigrants came up from Mexico and stayed at this mission to rest. And then they headed west to found La Ciudad de Nuestra Señora Reina de los Ángeles del Río Porciúncula, which is the city of Our Lady, Queen of the Angels by the river Porciúncula. That's the official name of the city. The mission bells you see here, you've seen them along the El Camino, along Highway 101. They were first put up by the California Federation of Women's Clubs in 1902. They were spaced 1 to 2 miles apart all along the 400-mile route of the El Camino. Over time, that organization dissolved, and the state took over the responsibility to maintain them outside of particular cities. So any state highway, Caltrans would maintain the bells. And by 2005, Caltrans had restored 555 bells from San Diego all the way to Sonoma. As they traveled westward, the expedition came to a place that had a good water supply and plentiful trees, so they camped on a small hill overlooking the river. That hill is today's Elysian Park, and that's the Los Angeles River, which looks a little bit different than when the Spanish saw it. When the Spanish saw it, it was free-flowing, it was deep and clear, cold, and plentiful. And that hill was a wonderful place to look over where they're headed to. And there's the San Gabriel Mountains above us. I believe that's Mount Wilson. That's at the very top. If you go to Elysian Park, which is not far from Dodger Stadium, you can actually see a plaque left there to commemorate the camping spot of the Portola expedition. There are various places along the 400-mile journey that now have markers. Sometimes you really have to look for them, but it's nice that you still can find them. Now they were continuing westward, and they came upon these pools of tar that was bubbling up from deep below, which made them think there may be volcanoes in the area. Their view of it was that, oh, this would be perfect pitch to use for maintaining the cracks in ships. So already they were looking towards a way of using this pitch that they could use. Well, of course, Los Angeles was underneath a huge supply of oil and this tar. And over the years, scientists who were studying this area were looking at this old asphalt mine back in the 20s, and they found lots and lots of bones. So they kept digging and exploring, and they found millions of fossils, probably the most famous being the saber-toothed tiger and the mammoth. This is the George Page Museum, which displays hundreds of fossils of plants, insects, reptiles, and mammals that were trapped over eons of time. It's a wonderful place to take families because they are showing you, they're still pulling fossils out, and they have a lab where you can watch them as they are cleaning fossils, and they give demonstrations of that. So if you're ever giving tours for families in the Los Angeles area, this museum is definitely on your to-do list. I used to play around the tar pits when I was a kid. And my mom said, if you're not careful, you're going to end up being a fossil like all the other animals, but I never fell in. As they went through the San Fernando Valley and came up along the coast, they came to around the area in Ventura County, and they met the Chumash people. The Spaniards were amazed at these people because they were a seagoing people. They had made these boats just using flint tools by shaping wood into planks and then basically stitching the planks together and then using that pitch to seal the boat. And these were amazingly seaworthy canoes, and they could travel up and down the coast. In fact, they would go visit up and down the coast and out to the Channel Islands quite frequently. In fact, there were Indian villages living out on the Channel Islands as well. The men would go out past the breakers and hunt for seals and even small whales. And because the Spanish saw them making these boats, they called the place Carpinteria, or the place of the carpenters. Because they had the bounty of the sea and the resources of the land, they were described by the Spanish as being very strong and healthy and very friendly. In fact, one whole village came to the expedition's camp and spent the whole day dancing and singing into the night. Finally, the officers had to tell the Indians to please go away, and they gave them lots of beads to bribe them to leave them alone so they could get some sleep. The villages were large, and family groups would live in these large tule homes. The men were naked, wrote Crespi, just like Adam before he sinned, as he wrote. The women wore grass and deerskin skirts. Costanzo, in his diary, noted that only the chiefs were allowed to have 2 wives. And he also wrote that in all their towns, there was noticed a class of men who lived like women, associated with them, wore the same dress, adorned themselves with beads and earrings, and enjoyed great consideration among all the people. You know, among Native Americans, your sexual orientation wasn't a big deal to them. If you wanted to live as a woman, that was perfectly fine. You could do women's work, and there was not a big problem. I'm pleased to say that the Chumash are undergoing a revival of their culture. And here are some young Chumash men who actually built a traditional canoe and took it out for a sail out in the ocean. They periodically have these, I guess you call them living history days, where you can go into their recreated village and they will show you their way of life and spread the knowledge of their culture and their people. It was here among the Chumash people that Mission Santa Barbara was established in 1786. The first church was destroyed in the earthquake of 1812, and the present church was built in 1820. The towers were rebuilt after the earthquake of 1925. And of course, it was the Chumash people who did all the building, who quarried the stone, or made the adobe bricks, who built the aqueducts, who planted the crops, and tended the animal herds. Now, I want to say something about the mission system. This could take a couple hours, but I'm going to try to be brief here. The mission system was established by the Spanish to make the native people citizens of the Spanish Empire by making them Christians and self-sufficient farmers. They thought they were doing the Native Americans a favor by teaching the faith so they would go to heaven, and teaching them trades and farming so they could be self-sufficient, as if they didn't already have a religion and have plenty of food already. It was kind of the same thinking as plantation owners who thought they were giving the same rationale that they had, that they were doing the Black people a favor by giving them work to do. We know, of course, that the missions ultimately brought disease and starvation to native tribes. The cattle and sheep ate all the native plants, which deprived even the non-mission Indians of food, and diseases like smallpox and especially measles really decimated the tribes. The population of, I told you the population of California natives was about maybe 500,000, let's say. Well, by 1850, the population was 25,000. They had a stunning decrease of 90%. So the missions were, despite perhaps the good intentions of the priests, it just brought death and destruction to the people. They might be beautiful. They might have started industries like winemaking and olive production, but they spelled the death knell for a lot of native people. And I have to say that this story is finally being changed in the California state textbooks for 4th grade, which is California history, which is what I taught. They're now telling the true story of the missions that, there were good padres and bad padres. And there was a lot of abuse. If you were baptized, you were considered a member of the mission and you weren't allowed to leave. And if you left, you would be brought back and beaten, or you could be beaten for infractions. The males and females were separated in the dormitories. They weren't always given the greatest amount of food. So it was basically like a plantation system. And that story needs to be told by people like you. When you talk about the missions, you need to tell the full story, the good and the bad of these missions. It wasn't just the romantic view that we had back in the 1950s of the missions. Anyway, getting back to the expedition, here's another path. It's actually called the Portola Trail, which is just south of Morro Bay. And if you look in the over in the far right corner, you can just see a little mound peeking over the trees. That's the rock at Morro Bay, Morro Rock. So that gives you an idea of where you are. So you can follow that same trail that the Portola expedition had leading up to Morro Bay. They came to a lake where they camped out, and they called this Oso Flaco Lake. They named it because the scouts had killed a very lean bear near here. They didn't realize that the bear was lean because it was probably had been poisoned by the Indians. The Indians would leave poisoned meat around their villages to kill bears, keep them away from their village. And the soldiers ate this poisoned meat and they got sick. So from then on, they never killed a lean bear. I don't believe any of the soldiers died from eating that bear meat, though. Grizzlies were very common in California, as you know, especially in the central California and Northern California. The grizzlies were huge in number. And in fact, some places got their name from the grizzly bears. Los Osos near San Luis Obispo got its name because of all the bears that were sighted in that area. Of course, the settlers in Sonoma, when they decided to declare the California Republic, chose the grizzly bear for the emblem of the state because of its power and strength. And then they proceeded to kill all the grizzly bears. So we don't have grizzly bears anymore in California. They thought about reintroducing them, but that's going to be a hard sell to tell campers that we're going to put grizzly bears in Yosemite. I don't think that's going to work. Here is Morro Rock. We know now that this was the inside of a volcano, which gradually wore away. But the Spanish were just impressed by the size of it, but they were more impressed, I think, by all the sea otters that they saw there and the seals, and out in the distance, the whales. And of course, this is the big attraction of Morro Bay because you can still see the otters come right into the harbor there at Morro Bay, and you can take kayaks out there to see them up close. It's still a great place for visitors. And this was the reason that eventually the Russians did come down and set up Fort Ross, which was their southernmost outpost in California. And they were there for a number of years, and they almost wiped out the entire sea otter population, almost, but not quite. After leaving Morro Bay and passing through what is now San Luis Obispo, the Spanish came to the cliffs of Big Sur, and they realized this was going to be impossible to go along the coast at this point. So they were going to have to go inward. But to go inward, they were going to have to cross over the Santa Lucia Mountains. And again, this was going to be a real trial because they're very steep, very rocky. It took them 2 weeks to get over these mountains. And finally, they came down into this large bay, which was rimmed by sand dunes and had a large river emptying into it. This is exactly how Vizcaíno had described it way back in 1608, I believe it was. So they had the description, they had a map, but to Portola, it did not seem that this was the bay. He later admitted to friends years later that he must have been hallucinating to not recognize it as Monterey Bay, but it just didn't look right to them. So they had a council and they decided, well, maybe it's just a bit farther north. Maybe there's another bay. So they continued walking north. They camped near Pinto Lake, which is near Watsonville. You can see where they camped near here. And they encountered their first redwood tree near here. These may not be the same trees they saw, they probably not, but this is at Pinto Lake Park. And the Spanish were flabbergasted to see such tall trees that were so tall, so straight, and the girth was so large. And they called them the Arbol de Madera Roja, which is redwood tree. By the time they got to the area of San Gregorio Creek in San Mateo County, they were beginning to have their doubts about where they were. According to the latitude, they should have seen Monterey by now. But they, according to what they saw on the map, they didn't see it yet. So they just continued north. Finally, they came up to the western edge of Montara Mountain, came to the top there over Pedro Point. There's Pedro Point to the left in Pacifica. And from there, you can see the whole of San Francisco Bay, and that's what the Spanish had called it from the early explorations. And it was bounded by Point Reyes. If you look at over in the middle left, it's kind of a hazy day, but you could actually see the point of sorry, I'm just having a brain freeze right here. So they can see the point of Point Reyes, and you can see Mount Tamalpais way in the distance, and the curve around San Francisco leading to here. So this was all called San Francisco Bay by the early Spanish navigators. So now these Spanish are really having their doubts about whether they've come to Monterey. And then they looked westward and they saw the Farallones. Now they knew the latitude of the Farallones, and now they realized that they had come way too far north and they had missed Monterey. They camped out near the modern Lindemar Beach in Pacifica. And if they had just come much later, they could have eaten at the Taco Bell, which is rather famous for its views. They now had to figure out their next move, and in the meantime, they were hungry. So they sent an expedition to find some deer. And they weren't far from an Indian village in Pacifica, Puristac, which, like all the other Indian villages of the Ohlone people, had the Tule homes, and you can see there's a lot going on here. You can see the hunters coming back with the deer towards the center. You can see the woman in the foreground who's probably making acorn soup. You can see them hanging out meat to dry over on the right. They're making another house over to the right. So everybody was very busy, and this is the kind of thing they would have seen throughout the Bay Area. So now in the North Bay, they had come into a territory of a number of tribes. So where the San Francisco Peninsula is, that was mostly the Ohlone tribe, which extended all along the peninsula and a bit to the South Bay and some of the East Bay. To the north, in what is now Marin County, were the Coast Miwok. Then to Sonoma County was the Pomo people. Over in Napa County were the Wapo people. In the North Bay was the Patwin people. Over in the East Bay were the Bay Miwoks and the Yokuts in the Delta area. And remember, all these people had different languages, but there was obviously a lot of trade going on because the people on the coast, which had an abundance of seashells and mussels, would trade those shells, which are like money to these tribes, for obsidian, which came all the way from St. Helena. So there's definitely trade going on among all these tribes. Well, Sergeant Ortega came back very excited to say that I saw this great estuary on the other side of the mountains. So the next day, they all came up, including Portola, to the ridge above the beach, which is now Pacifica. And they came up to the ridge on November 4th, 1769. And that was the first time that Europeans had seen San Francisco Bay. They told Portola that, isn't this wonderful that you can fit the entire Spanish Navy here? And this could be a wonderful place for Presidio and a mission. And isn't this fantastic? And Portola said, okay. He wasn't very excited because he knew at this point they were going to have to go all the way back to try to find Monterey again. So they had come way too far north. So he actually was rather disappointed. This is an artist's rendering of what they might have seen. Although this just shows you the topography. Actually, it would have been a very active scene. You would have seen thousands and thousands of birds flying and migrating and nesting. You would have seen perhaps deer herds all around San Bruno Mountain. You would have seen smokes from the East Bay of all the villages in the East Bay. There's Mount Tam on the far right. So it would have been an astounding view to them. This is how it looks today. Pretty much filled in. There's San Bruno Mountain to the left. In the foreground is San Bruno and South San Francisco. The airport is over there a little bit to the right. You can see Highway 101, the roadway of 101 in the middle right, the far right. So this was a much different view now than back then. It wasn't until years later, 7 years later, that the Anza expedition came up. And that was the group to actually settle San Francisco. So they brought immigrants up from Mexico. About 200 came in that expedition to found the Presidio and Pueblo and mission of San Francisco, which they did. And the Presidio was founded on June 29th, 1776. That's the birthday of San Francisco, the official birthday. Every June, they have a celebration at the Presidio, not this year, but typically they have a big ceremony where they have Soldados Mexicanos and Padres, and they have a big celebration. They have dancing and so on. And about 200 descendants of the Anza expedition come to that gathering. So you have the Moragas and the Noriegas and all those people that are still around in the Bay Area and still honor their arrival years ago to San Francisco. So the Presidio became the furthermost northern outpost of the Spanish Empire in North America. About the same time, mission San Francisco was founded, and they wanted to put the church miles away from the Presidio to keep them away from the soldiers. So they built this mission, and here's a bit of trivia for you. This is the only mission out of all 21 missions that remains intact from the day it was built. All the other missions pretty much fell apart, and even during the 1906 earthquake, the cathedral next door fell apart, but this mission stayed strong and sturdy because of the way it was built. The walls are 6 foot thick, and you can still see the Indian paintings on the roofs of the mission, on the redwood beams, and you can still see the some of the original paintings that were brought up from Mexico. The reredos, the decoration behind the altar was brought up from Mexico. So it is really the original mission. And interestingly, this is the only mission of all 21 missions that's curated by a Native American. Andrew Galvan, his great grandfather was an Indian chief of the Ohlone, and he was baptized by the Padres. And Andrew himself, a descendant of that, a tribal descendant, is also an anthropologist. So he looks at this mission in many different eyes. And he's also changing the narrative of this mission from the Spanish point of view to the Indian point of view, to the Native people point of view, which is a remarkable accomplishment. So I urge you to go visit the mission to see how they interpret the mission history. And if you can ever take a tour with Andrew, he's a very fine tour guide. So that little entry into the journal of Father Crespi talking about a bay was the impetus for the Viceroy of Mexico to send an expedition to found a mission and presidio on that peninsula. And that led to the growth of a city, which turned out to be a great city in the western part of the United States, probably one of the greatest cities in the world. Here we have an aerial view of that modern city now. There's Washington Square, there's Saints Peter and Paul Church, Coit Tower, downtown San Francisco, the Bay Bridge. But you know, the Ohlone people are still around. They come up to the Presidio every year, and they have a big time celebration where they do dancing and singing and meet people and tell them something of their culture. And you know, the Native people have much to teach us. They were the first caretakers of this land. They would burn the land periodically to cut down on the brush to allow the native grasses to grow again. They had such respect for nature that they would say a prayer before they even pulled up a plant. They would pray to the plant spirit, and they would pray to the animal after they killed it, to thank them for giving its life, and to apologize, but to say that you are now part of my spirit and I will keep you within me. So they had a beautiful view of the world, and it's for us to learn something from them because they have much to teach us. Now, if you want to take a snapshot of this page shows native sites that you can visit around the Bay Area. If you can't take a snapshot of it, just send me an email. My email is sfwalkingtours@gmail.com. That's sfwalkingtours@gmail.com. And I'll email you this page. And if you took a picture of that, here's the next one. This includes a bibliography that I think you'd find very useful. I have copies of Nick Neely's book. He actually walked the entire Portola Trail a few years ago, and he wrote a book about it. And I have signed copies of that book for only $20. It's a hardbound book, but it's really good. I got a lot of my information from him. So he compares what Portola saw with what is there today. I highly recommend that book. And another one I highly recommend is The Ohlone Way by Malcolm Margolin, who was the first one to write about the history of the Ohlone people. And the last one I'm going to recommend is Bad Indians, the first book written by a native Californian about the history of her people and how it changed their lives and what their lives are like today. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to, okay.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Yes, that I think everyone will agree. The pictures were phenomenal. Everybody was just commenting on just how great the information was and how beautiful the pictures. I want to say to everyone here that Steve, if you give me the links to this copy, I can put these in a forum on the website so people can get this.
Great.
And for those who, if you want to send out, please, you can contact me or like you said, Steve, but I'd like to take the so I don't have to do the work. So we do have a couple questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat right now and I will ask Steve. So we have right here, what we got? Oh, Newton Butler asked, do these tribes from Southern California's past have any kind of pueblo or settlement base where some of them still might choose either to live or at least gather to share olden stories and teach their kids about their past?
Boy, this is a big subject. I'm going to try to narrow it down as best I can. When the Americans came, the American period was a horrible period for the Native Americans because at least the Spanish didn't intentionally try to kill the Indians, but the Americans did. They did practice genocide. In fact, the first governor of California put a bounty on the scalps of Native Californians. That's how bad it was. And that's why another reason their population plummeted. So they herded the Native Americans into these supposed reservations, and then they said, "Oh well, we'll give you this land, and you can keep this land, and then the Great Fathers in Washington will allow you to keep this land." Well, those treaties were never ratified. So not only were they taken off their land, but they weren't given the land they were supposed to have been given by the government. So they ended up becoming basically vaqueros on ranches. They went wherever they could live, and it took them a long time to get any land back. The state of California has deeded some property back to the tribes, but there are only two federal reservations in California. One is the Hoopa Reservation up in Northern California that has mostly Modoc and Hoopa people. And I forget what the second one is, but there are hundreds of rancherias that were either deeded or kept in the property of the Indian people. And these rancherias, like there's one up at Stewart's Point where the Pomo people live, and if they have enough land, they build a dance house to keep them, to have a place to go for social gatherings. Now, one big advantage now that the Native people got was the ability to put casinos on any property they had. So these casinos have been a boon to some tribes, and many of these tribes have now built communal houses and museums for their people. They built houses, living houses for the people, and health centers. So for some tribes that have a casino, those have been good for them. But there are many tribes that don't, and a lot of tribes are still asking for federal recognition because that would allow them to have federal aid and title to some land. But unfortunately, our senators, like Senator Feinstein, has been stalling a lot of those requests for federal recognition for whatever reason. So if you want to write a letter to Senator Feinstein, you can say, what's the problem? Why aren't you recognizing these California tribes? So yes, there are some tribes that do have tribal lands, and you can go visit them. If you look up California tribes and a lot of them have websites now, and you can go and see where they're located and if they have visitors.
Awesome. Thank you. Jason Cohen asks, Steve, was the Pueblo of San Francisco mainly families of the soldiers? Did they mostly live at around the Presidio? Some sources say the Spanish SF Bay was today's Drake's Bay. Others say it was the whole area from Pacifico to Point Reyes. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So the original San Francisco Bay, according to the charts made by navigators, was that area from Point Reyes down to Pedro Point, that huge expanse. They never saw the bay itself because from the sea, you can't see that narrow gap, which leads into San Francisco Bay. And by the way, that strait wasn't discovered until 1770 by Pedro Fages, when he came up from Monterey and was reconnoitering the East Bay, and he saw the gap from Alameda, from the East Bay. So Anza was the one who actually saw the strait and located the Presidio not far from the strait. But the people who came up from the Anza expedition, some of them were settlers. So they founded the little settlement of Yerba Buena, which was the Pueblo. And if they were families of the military officers, they would stay at the Presidio. Families of the soldiers would stay at the Pueblo.
Awesome. Let's see. Steve, can you confirm that the subgroup of the Ohlone people who were in San Francisco were the Ramaytush?
Right. So, the Ohlone were not all one big tribe. They were individual tribelets, and each tribelet was almost separate unto themselves. So the Ramaytush were the ones that we associate with the peninsula.
I have a question for you. I was very intrigued by the fact that that you said that the men were, at the time, it didn't matter if they wanted to do women's work, like they had a cross of gender and things like that. Is that still the same in tribes now, do you know, or is that just
because Native people had to live so intimately together as a tribe, as a group, they were extremely tolerant of differences. So if you, if you wanted to live with women, you certainly could. Although there were certain taboos you had to follow, like, women could not go hunting because that would break a taboo. It was a very orderly system. Everybody had their specific chores to do. So women were in charge of gathering the plants and the roots. Men were in charge of hunting, because the men would go through a hunting ritual that was only allowed for men to go into the sweat house for the most part. However, there were some tribes where the women could become a chief, and they would rule that particular village.
Let's see. Do you have any comment on the specific materials that were used in the basketry?
Yes, there were sedges and grasses that they all knew about. And even today, the Pomo women have to get permission to go on private lands to gather the particular sedges and grasses that they use for their weaving. The sedge tended to be the darker of the grasses used, and they'd actually have to peel them away to get them to be thinner. But if you go to Indian basketry making, you can find out more information about the specific plants they use for basket making.
And would that be the same place to find out where you can take a class to find this tradition?
I'll do some research on that, and whoever's interested can send me an email, and I will let you know about those classes.
I personally would like to know about that. And I agree with you about the Taco Bell down in Pacifica. It has a great view.
It actually got a write-up among the top 10 Taco Bells in the United States because you could sit there and have a margarita and a taco and watch the surfers.
Exactly. That my husband's a surfer, and we'll go down there, and it's the
Okay.
best.
Yep. Yep.
So I keep some people are just beautiful, informative presentation. Thank you, Steve. Fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Awesome talk. Very interesting. Really enjoyed it. And like I said, we'll put these on the forum. I also just wanted to remind everyone, if you would like to donate to Steve's cause, he's committed to all the gratuities received to go to the Navajo people, and his PayPal has been posted, but I will repost it in the chat again. And let's see if we have anything else. No, just thank you for a great presentation. So,
Thank you.
yeah, Steve, I really just I want to thank you for taking the time and not only just presenting it, but all your history and your knowledge of this. It's really hearing this. I mean, this was just all these beautiful pictures, and hearing this was fantastic. And I needed the brush up of information for sure, and I learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people could say that. I want to share, but we can close this up, and please do come, and we would love to have have you do another talk. Please, please, please.
Great. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks again to Steve. Thanks again to all the participants. We topped out, I think it was at about 52 or 3.
Great.
And many of them have stayed in this long. So thanks very much to everybody for joining us and participating.
And thank you, all members and everyone that was here. It's always so great to see your faces. And if I don't see your face, at least I see your name and I know that you're here. And we'll be doing more of this. So please come and jump on board again. And we'll go from there. Steve, if you have any other things that you want to talk to Lynn about, we can do this.
I just want to say thanks for everybody for joining, and I hope that some of this information was valuable no matter where you are in California.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Len, if you want to unmute everybody, you can unmute
sure.
everybody. And then
I think people have the power to unmute themselves.
Yes.
Maybe somebody wants to give it a try and tell me if it.
Yeah, Newton. So anyway, please feel free to unmute yourself at this point. The presentation's over. Lana, you can keep recording or not. But if anybody wants to say hi or check in, or how's everybody doing?
Thanks, Steve. It was great.
Thank you so much. It was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Very well done.
Very enlightening.
Great. Thank you.
Unmute everybody.
Len or Helen, where is this link going to be available to people beyond the guild?
Probably not, huh?
Possibly. We'll talk about that, Stephen, Len, and I, and then we'll see. That will be Steve's choice because it is his.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
So stay tuned.
There are several of us who are retired from the guild.
Great.
I never thought
Hi.
tour guys retired.
Oh, I love being retired. Are you kidding me? This was great. This really was very interesting.
Awesome. Great to have you here.
All right. Bye, everyone. And it was wonderful seeing you all.
Nice seeing you, Rosalie.
We mean well.
Yeah. Hey, Steve, I have a question for you. You made mention about the Native women going to private lands now to do it. My friends just bought 50 acres up in Placerville. And I know they have this, I think it's Shingle Springs, the Miwoks up there.
Yes. Yes.
And they have tons of acorns up there. And we were just wondering, is there a way that they would be happy to have people come on their land and to harvest what they needed in that sense? Do you know a way to connect
Yes.
with that?
I know the two guys who run the Ohlone Cafe over, and I forgot to mention this, but these are two Ohlone men who run the the cafe there, and they make acorn bread as part of their menu.
Mhm.
So I will get in touch with them. And in fact, I'd like to collect some acorns too, because I'd like to bring them into the classroom and show kids what they look like and how you process them. So sure.
All right, great. That's awesome. And if I find them, I will pick them up for you and bring them to you.
Yeah, please, please.
I
And just
can.
a quick note, on Friday at noontime, there is a webinar that is done by the Peninsula Open Space Trust, and it is the park ranger for Santa Cruz County that knows all the history about the Native American Indians who lived in Santa Cruz. And he's been doing it for the last 2 weeks. And this Friday is the last talk that he's going to do. And the guy is fabulous. He knows everything about the tribes, particularly in the Bay Area and the Peninsula area, Santa Cruz County also. So check it out. It's the Peninsula Open Space Trust. And you got to sign up for it. And it's Friday at noon.
And it's free. And thanks for mentioning that, because I saw the first one, and you're right, he's excellent.
So I'll give y'all another place you can check out something. It's a tour company I've been watching out of Chicago. It's called Chicago Detours, Detours. And they've been doing virtual walks and for different neighborhoods of Chicago, even did a boat trip down the Chicago River. They only take about a half hour to an hour to do because it's done virtually. There's no drive time. You go from one spot to the other instantly, just pressing the button on the computer. And they're well done. And if you want to, they use Google Maps a lot. And if you want to see people developing virtual tours, this is a good company to watch because there's 4 people who do it, or no, 4. And they're all very well educated and very knowledgeable. And it's very diversified in what they're seeing. Last week we were in, he took us on a tour of Western Michigan, the sand dunes along the lake there. And there's some spectacular houses. He's been in various neighborhoods. The lady who owns the company is very knowledgeable, and she loves museums and bars. Any tour she does, you pass a bar, she's taking you into the bar. Okay? So it's a wonderful little tour company, Chicago Detours. Check them out. The tours are free. They do have some, like the boat trip is an $8 ticket, but most of the tours are free at this particular point. They're eventually going to start charging, but right now they're developing it while we're all locked down in the pandemic. They're doing these wonderful virtual tours, and so check it out. It's something I'm quite interested in, to be honest.
Ken, are we going to see one from you here in about San Francisco?
I'm still working on my house.
Well, when you're done with that.
That's first priority.
I know.
Staying alive right now.
New York City's going to be starting something like that called Tour Your Own City, that they're going to be doing some stuff like that too.
Well, let's see if we can beat out New York.
Yeah, let's do it. We got to go. Wow, that's a project right there.
Yeah.
I have another question for you. It's, Native American, or is it Native people of California? What is the correct term to use?
All right. So this is another long talk, but I'll shorten it down. So there are some tribes that prefer to be called by their tribal name. Some people don't mind being called Indian because they've actually adopted that name and say it proudly because that's how they've been known for so long, and they want to kind of turn around that name to be a positive thing. And then some people want to be known by Native Californians. So you just have to be sensitive because they interchange these terms. I interchange the terms, but if I know them in particular, I try to go talk to them by their tribal name, so that you can't go wrong by calling by their tribal name.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. I know that's like great.
I probably should have mentioned it at the very beginning because that's an important question.
Well, it's a very interesting. That's an interesting topic as well. Just the sensitivity,
Yes.
the sensitivity training of that.
Yes.
Of all the different tribes and the names and it's just, it's ripe at this time too, you know, with everything that's going on.
In fact, I'm going to see if I can get Vincent Medina, who is one of those Ohlone men, to see if he can give a video presentation, because it really would be better to have a native Californian speak about his people. I've heard him speak before. He's fabulous. So we might have to pay him a stipend, but I think it'd be well worth the money and the time to do that.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, anybody else have any questions for Steve?
And nice to see you again, Steve.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Historical
To see
Society.
you.
And
Well,
Steve,
my timing, you know, I learned timing from ITMI, so I knew I had to be right on the mark.
You were.
we did great.
Thank
And we want more, and we'll be talking.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Be well.
everyone.
Stay well.